There were two things happening at the same time that I need you to understand before I tell you the rest of it. The first, I was in a hospital room in Burlington on a Tuesday in March, 4 days into my second round of chemotherapy, unable to keep water down, watching my phone tell me the cancer fund my community had built for me was sitting at $34,000. The second, my brother Daniel was 90 minutes away in Harwick, Vermont, standing on a dock, signing the purchase agreement for a 24-foot bayliner he had been looking at since the previous fall. I did not know about the boat yet. I would not know for another 6 weeks. But I had the envelope by then. I had been holding on to it since January, since before the diagnosis turned serious, tucked in the filing cabinet in my apartment between the lease and the tax returns, waiting for a moment I had not yet been able to name. None of them saw the envelope coming. Daniel least of all. I want to tell you everything. But the envelope belongs at the end, where it happened. So stay with me. What was in it is not something you'll forget easily. And what my brother's face did when he understood what he was holding, I'll get there. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, the place where we sit with ordinary people, real choices, and the quiet moment when everything finally turns. If you've ever been robbed by someone who was supposed to protect you, if you've ever had to find your footing again when the ground was pulled out from underneath you, this one is for you. Don't go anywhere. Subscribe before we go further, and let's get back to it. My name is Renata Flood, and I was 31 years old when my brother stole from me while I was learning to stay alive. I want you to know who I was before the cancer, because the person I was before it is the reason the cancer did not end me, and the reason the theft did not end me either. I grew up in Harwick, Vermont, population 6,100 in the generous count, a small enough town that your family's history arrived in a room before you did. My father, Owen Flood, had been a high school math teacher for 27 years before he retired. My mother, Carol, had run the front desk at the county assessor's office for 19 years and understood the way paperwork moved through bureaucracies the way other people understand weather. She was the kind of woman who filed things correctly the first time, who kept copies of everything, who believed that documentation was a form of respect for the future. I absorbed that from her the way you absorb things from parents you admire without quite noticing you're learning. I had a brother named Daniel who was 4 years older than me and who had spent his adult life in a state of perpetual almost. Almost finished his business degree. Almost launched the landscaping company. Almost made the down payment on the house. Daniel was not lazy, I want to be clear about that. He was a person who moved toward things with genuine energy and then encountered some friction and redirected, and then moved toward something else, and the redirection had become, over the years, the main event. He was charming the way people are charming when they've learned that charm can substitute for follow-through. He told a good story. He laughed easily. He was the kind of older brother who called on your birthday and forgot it the next day. My parents had spent decades mediating the space between Daniel's intentions and his outcomes. A loan here, a co-signature there, the particular parental calculus of keeping a child afloat without drowning yourself in the process. I had watched it my whole life, and I had made a private decision early that I would not participate in it, not out of cruelty, out of the understanding that a system of rescue never teaches anyone to swim. I was a financial analyst at a regional accounting firm in Burlington. I had been there since I was 24, working my way from junior analyst to a position where I managed client portfolios and understood, in the granular way that numbers people understand things, exactly how money moved and where it went, and what the trail looked like when it was followed carefully. I drove 40 minutes each way on I-89, which I did not mind because I used the time to think, playing through client problems in my head the way other people listen to music, working through the logic of a thing before I had to commit it to paper. I lived in a one-bedroom apartment in Winooski with a small balcony where I kept a container garden that required more attention than made practical sense for a person who worked my hours, but which I tended anyway because some things you do for reasons that have nothing to do with efficiency. Tomatoes in the summer. Herbs through the fall. The kind of small living thing that requires daily attention and gives you something specific to do with your hands after a day of staring at screens. My life at 31 was organized and purposeful and mostly quiet in the way I had made it quiet, which was deliberately. I had $22,000 in savings. I had a 401k I contributed to the maximum I could afford. I had 3 good friendships, the kind that are not frequent but are reliable, and a relationship with my parents that was warm and steady, and built on the shared understanding that I was competent, and they did not need to worry about me. This last part was perhaps the thing I had worked hardest on and was most proud of. My parents had worried about Daniel for 35 years. I had decided at 17 that I would not be a source of worry, and I had kept that promise with a consistency I found genuinely satisfying. I paid my bills on the day they arrived. I kept my apartment in a state that could receive a visitor without warning. I called my mother on Sunday evenings. I was the child they did not have to think about, which I understood was a form of love on my part, even if it was also, if I was honest with the notebook I kept, occasionally lonely in the specific way that competence can be lonely. There is no one who rushes to help the person who has always been fine. That was about to change dramatically, in all directions at once. I was 31 years old, and I had been having a persistent ache in my lower back since October that 3 different people had told me was probably related to the way I sat at my desk. It was not related to the way I sat at my desk. Cervical cancer, my oncologist Dr. Ewan told me in December, with the particular precision of a person who has said difficult things so many times, they have found a language for it that is honest without being brutal. Stage 2. The treatment options were real, and the prognosis was what she would call cautiously optimistic, which I had enough medical literacy to understand was not the same as optimistic. We would start with chemotherapy followed by radiation. We would be aggressive. She used the word aggressive the way surgeons use it, meaning thorough, meaning we are not going to lose this because we were not paying attention. I drove home from that appointment on a December afternoon with the roads icy and the sky the particular gray Vermont gets in December, a gray that is not threatening so much as settled, and I sat in my parking lot for 22 minutes. I had a notebook in my bag, the kind I kept for work, narrow-ruled, dark blue cover. I took it out and I opened to a fresh page and I wrote the date and I wrote, Stage 2. Then I wrote the questions I needed answered before I could begin thinking clearly about what came next. Treatment timeline, insurance coverage gaps, leave from work, who needed to be told and in what order and what the telling would cost me. I was a person who made lists when the ground shifted. The lists were how I kept standing. I called my parents first. Then I called Daniel, because he was my only sibling and blood required it. He said all the right things on the phone. He said he was there, whatever I needed, that I only had to ask. I wrote in the notebook, Daniel called supportive. I filed it the way I filed everything, accurately and without editorial. I told my supervisor at the firm the following week. She was a practical woman named Margaret who had navigated her own medical crisis 2 years earlier and who did not make it sentimental or difficult. She arranged for a modified schedule, remote work for the weeks I couldn't make the drive, and assured me that my position was not at risk. I kept working. Not out of stubbornness, though I am stubborn. Out of the understanding that work was a structure and structure was something I needed more, not less, when everything else was uncertain. The cancer fund was not my idea. My neighbor in the apartment complex, a woman named June Acaffer who was 58 and had been a hospice nurse for 22 years, and who brought me soup when I had a cold without being asked, came to my door 3 days after I told her about the diagnosis. She had a yellow legal pad and 2 cups of coffee, and a look on her face that said she had already thought through what she was going to propose. She said, medical costs for a stage 2 cancer treatment run between $80,000 and $150,000 depending on complications, and your insurance will cover a portion but not all, and the rest is going to land somewhere, and she would like to set up a community fund so that the landing was softer. She said this the way she said most things directly, without making it about her own generosity, as if it were simply a logistical problem she had identified a solution for. I said I didn't want charity. She said, Renata, you've been bringing in my mail when my back acts up for 3 years. You brought casseroles when my sister died. You helped Mrs. Ferrer's kid with college applications for free because she asked you at the mailbox. You have been putting into this community your whole adult life. Let it come back to you. That's not charity, that's how communities work. I held the coffee cup for a long time. You'll run the fund? I said. I have already looked into the platform, she said. She ran it with the precision you would expect from someone who had managed care plans for dying patients for 22 years. She set up the online collection. She sent letters to the Harwick Community Board and the Burlington firm where I worked, and the church my parents attended. and the neighborhood association and the elementary school where I had once tutored reading 3 afternoons a week. She was organized and transparent, and she posted updates every 2 weeks detailing the balance and the designated purpose, which was Renata Flood's cancer treatment and recovery costs. In 6 weeks, the fund raised $34,000. I want to tell you how that felt, because the amount of it is not the whole of it. I had grown up in Harwick. I had left for Burlington at 22, and I had come back on weekends and holidays, and I had thought of myself as a person who was from there without quite being of it anymore, the way people who leave small towns sometimes feel. What $34,000 from people who knew me and people who didn't, from former teachers and neighbors, and the woman who ran the dry cleaner on Main Street, and several complete strangers who had heard through someone who had heard through someone else. What that amount told me was that I had been wrong about how connected I still was. I was woven in more tightly than I had understood. The fund was proof of it. June was the fund administrator. The money sat in a dedicated account she had set up with my name as beneficiary and her name as administrator, which meant distributions required her signature and mine. She had done this deliberately, she told me. 2 signatures, she said, because you are about to be sick and tired and vulnerable, and I will not have this money exposed to the wrong kind of attention. I had nodded at the time. I had not fully understood what she meant. I would understand in about 6 weeks. The first round of chemotherapy was in February. I will not walk you through the medicine in detail, because you either know it already from your own life or from someone close to you, and in that case you do not need the description, and if you don't know it, the description alone would not be sufficient to carry what it actually is. I will tell you only the shape of it. The days that were worse and the days that were less bad. The way your body becomes a negotiation. The particular quality of exhaustion that is not sleepiness but something more architectural, a fatigue that sits in the structure of things rather than the surface. I worked when I could. I called my parents. I texted June, who was 3 doors down, and checked in every morning with a text that said only today, and to which I replied with a number from 1 to 10, and she calibrated her response accordingly. A 3 got soup and company. A 7 got a thumbs up in space. She had invented this system without explaining it, and I had adopted it without asking, because it was exactly right. Daniel called twice in February. I am being precise about the number. He called once on a Sunday early in the month to ask how treatment was going, a call that lasted 11 minutes, and in which he mentioned, briefly, that he had been looking at boats. A friend of his had one, and they had taken it out on Lake Champlain the previous summer, and he had decided that having his own was the next thing. I said that sounded nice. I was lying on my couch with a heating pad and a nausea that was at a 4 out of 10, which I had calibrated as the acceptable working range, and what my brother was saying about boats was very far away. He called once more at the end of the month to say he was sorry he'd been out of touch, and that he was thinking of me. The call lasted 7 minutes. I did not count the calls to be resentful. I counted them because I am a person who tracks things, and because tracking things is how I understood what was actually happening rather than what people told me was happening. I want to stop here a second because I know some of you know this stretch. The weeks of treatment where the people who said, whatever you need, just ask, have quietly resumed their regular lives, and the ask has become harder than the doing without. If you've ever been sick and discovered, in the specific silence of a Tuesday morning, exactly who meant it and who didn't, leave one word below for me, just one. I read every single one. And subscribe, because the turn in this story is coming and you will want to be here for it. Now, back to it. The second round of chemotherapy began in March. Side effects were harder this time, which Dr. Ewan had prepared me for and which I had written down in my notebook as something to expect, and which was still different from experiencing. I was at the Burlington Hospital for the infusion, staying in a room the social worker had arranged through the hospital's patient housing program, and I was on day 4 when my phone showed a text from June. The text said, "Call me when you can, not urgent, but today if you're able." I called her that afternoon. June had a voice that stayed level through difficult things because her profession had required it for 22 years. Even so, there was something in her opening that I heard before she had said anything of substance. A quality of care that meant she was about to carry something into the room that she did not want to carry. She said, there was an irregularity in the fund account. She used the word irregularity the way doctors use cautiously optimistic. It was the professional term for what she could not yet call by its direct name. She had been reconciling the fund statements, which she did every 2 weeks, and she had found a series of transfers. 11 of them, over the previous 6 weeks, ranging from $800 to $4,200. Each one initiated with what appeared to be a valid dual signature authorization. Except June had not signed any of them. The signatures were hers, or something that looked enough like hers to have passed through the automated system, and they had been authorized on days when she had been working, reachable, and would absolutely have remembered authorizing a transfer from a cancer patient's medical fund. She had pulled every one. She had looked at each amount. She had traced each transfer to the destination account. The total was $26,400. I lay in the hospital bed with the phone against my ear and I looked at the ceiling for a long time. The ceiling was the standard ceiling of a hospital patient room, white acoustic tile with a small brown water stain in the upper right corner that I had memorized in 4 days. I said, "Where did it go?" June was quiet for one breath. Then she said she had traced it to an account in Daniel's name. I said, "Okay," she said. "Renata," I said. "Okay, I have it. Thank you for catching it." She started to say something about what we should do next, and I told her gently that I needed a few minutes and I would call her back. I ended the call. I set the phone on the bed beside me. The water stain was shaped like nothing specific. I looked at it for a long time anyway. Then I picked up the notebook. I wrote the date. I wrote, $26,400 transferred from fund account. Destination, Daniel Flood, forged authorizations. I wrote the dates June had given me. I wrote the amounts. I wrote them in a column the way I wrote everything neatly, with the amounts aligned on the right margin, because even in the worst moments I am still a financial analyst and columns are how I think. When I was done, I put the notebook on the bedside table and I looked at the ceiling for a while longer. There is a thing that happens when you discover a betrayal at the moment you are least equipped to respond to it. The anger is there. It is fully formed. But the body doesn't have the resources to carry it anywhere, so it just sits in you, enormous and immovable, and you sit with it. I sat with it. I had no other option. I was in a hospital bed on day 4 of a chemotherapy round that had already taken most of what I had. I could not call Daniel. I could not drive to Harwick. I could not do anything that the anger was asking me to do. What I could do was write it down, so I wrote it down. And I made a decision in that hospital room that I held to for the next 3 months. I was going to finish treatment first. I was going to get well. And then I was going to handle it in the way that it deserved to be handled, which was not with a phone call or a shouting match or a Thanksgiving dinner confrontation, but with paper, because paper was the language that meant something when you needed something to mean something permanently. I called June back. I told her to freeze the account. No further transfers, no new authorizations, nothing moves without an in-person signature from both of us with photo ID. She had already done it, of course she had. I told her not to contact Daniel. She said, "Are you sure?" I said, "I'm sure, not yet." She was quiet for a moment. "Okay," she said, "your pace." I want to tell you what the next 3 months looked like, because they were the hardest months and they were also the months that made the October afternoon possible. My pace was, get through this round, get through radiation, get to the other side of treatment, and then open the filing cabinet and take out the envelope. This sounds simple when I write it as a sentence. Living inside it was different. The second chemotherapy round ran through late March. The radiation began in April and ran 8 weeks. I finished active treatment in June and spent the summer in the particular suspended state of a person who is past the worst of the medicine but not yet past the disease, waiting on scans and blood work, and the slow, unreliable process of the body deciding what it was going to do. I was at a 4 on June's scale for most of April. I was at a 6 by July. I was at a 7 by August, which was the first time in 6 months I had texted her a 7. I worked when I could. Remote first, then in the office 2 days a week by May, which Margaret had calibrated carefully and which I was grateful for because the structure of work was one of the few things that organized the days the way they needed to be organized. My colleagues knew the broad outline. Nobody asked questions I hadn't invited. A woman in the fixed income group left a card on my desk one Monday in April that said only, "Glad you're back." That was the right amount. I did not contact Daniel. Not because I had forgiven him, though I had not. Not because I was not angry, though the anger had settled into something colder and more useful than the heat of it would have been. I didn't contact him because I had made a decision in a hospital room on a Tuesday in March that the work of healing and the work of justice were both serious, and I could not do them simultaneously without damaging both. Cancer gets your full attention, or it gets your whole life. That is the negotiation. I chose to pay full attention, which meant the accounting with Daniel had to wait in the filing cabinet alongside the envelope. I thought about him more than I wanted to, not with the anguish you might expect, with the specific register of a financial analyst who has identified an error in a ledger and can see exactly what the correction needs to look like. The anger was there. It was real. I am not going to tell you it wasn't. What I will tell you is that anger at the wrong time is not a tool. It is a liability, and I had enough liabilities that spring. I didn't need another one. June texted every morning. My parents called twice a week, my father on Sundays from the house phone and my mother on Tuesdays from her cell, which was the division of labor they had settled into without discussing it, and which told me something about how they were managing the worry. My father's Sunday calls were shorter and steadier. My mother's Tuesday calls were longer and sometimes circular, but she always ended them by saying, in the way she had said it since I was small, "You're going to be fine." She said it the way she said things she was working hard to believe. I let her say it. I said, "I know, Mom." I mostly believed it. That was the best I could do, and it was enough. Daniel called once more in May. He said he had been meaning to reach out. He said he hoped things were going better. He said things the way people say things when they have a specific reason to be hoping you are not paying too close attention. The call lasted 9 minutes. I wrote the date and the time in the notebook. I wrote, tone, careful, avoided specific questions about treatment or fund. I closed the notebook. My pace was the same pace it had always been. In September, Dr. Nguyen said admission. I wrote it in the notebook. One word. And then I closed the notebook, went home to my apartment in Winooski, stood on the balcony with the last of the summer herbs still in their containers, and I let myself feel the full weight of the word. Not triumphant, not even relieved exactly, something quieter and more structural than relief. A returning, the sense of a thing being handed back. Then I called June and told her it was time. I need to tell you about the envelope. In January, 2 weeks before my first round of chemotherapy, I had sat at my kitchen table on a Saturday morning with my dark blue notebook and the kind of clarity that sometimes arrives before a difficult thing, the window of calm before the system gets disrupted. I was a financial analyst. I understood misappropriation. I understood what it looked like and what it required to prove and what the remedies were. I had spent 9 years working with money and the documentation that surrounds it, and I understood, with the cold professional part of my mind, that the warm personal part was trying to drown out, that a $34,000 fund with a sick beneficiary and a family member with a documented history of financial difficulty was a specific kind of risk. I did not want to think it about my own brother. I thought it anyway. Because the difference between an analyst who is good at her job and one who is merely competent is the willingness to follow the logic of a thing, even when the destination is somewhere you would prefer not to arrive. I sat with the discomfort of it for one Saturday morning. I acknowledged it. I gave it its full weight. And then I treated it the way I treated any other risk I identified in my professional life. I built a structure around it so that if the worst happened, I would not be starting from zero. I spent 3 Saturdays in January on the preparation. I pulled Daniel's financial history, which I had partial access to through the co-signature paperwork from 2 loans my parents had brokered, loans I had helped them evaluate because they had asked me to, and because being the financially literate child in a family is a kind of permanent consultation. The history told a story of consistent shortfall and consistent cover. Nothing criminal in it, not yet. Just the pattern of a person who had spent years spending into gaps that other people subsequently filled. I drafted a letter to the Vermont Attorney General's Charitable Fraud Division explaining the structure of the fund and the risk exposure. Not as a complaint, not yet, but as a time-stamped notification that I had identified the risk and was documenting it. A marker in the official record, placed before anything happened, so that if anything happened, there would be no question about when I had known and what I had known. I prepared a civil demand document, specific and complete, that itemized the fund's origin, the authorized purpose, the dual signature requirement, and the civil and criminal exposure under Vermont statute for unauthorized transfer of charitable funds. I did not file it. I did not send it. I completed it because a document that is complete and unfiled is a different kind of tool than a document that still needs work. It is ready. It is waiting. It requires only a signature and an address. I printed all of it. I put it in a manila envelope, thick with the weight of 9 years of professional competence applied to the one problem I most wished I didn't have to solve. I wrote on the outside, in my own handwriting, Renata Flood Fund Documentation. January 14. And I put it in the filing cabinet between the lease and the tax returns. I had hoped never to use it. The hoping cost me nothing, and the preparation cost me 3 Saturday mornings, and a specific, contained grief over what it meant to need to prepare it. I allowed myself that grief and then I closed the drawer. I had prepared it anyway, because preparation is the only thing you control when you cannot control what the other person is going to do. I had learned that from my mother, who filed things correctly the first time and kept copies of everything, and believed that documentation was a form of respect for the future. I was respecting the future, even the hard version of it. June helped me access the bank's formal fraud investigation records after I finished treatment. This was September, 6 months after I had discovered the transfers from my hospital bed. I was not fully recovered. I would not be what I called fully recovered for another year, but I was past the active treatment phase, and I was functional in the specific way that means. Present, sharp, capable of the work. We met with the bank's fraud officer, a careful man named Stewart who had the institutional weariness of someone who had seen this before and the institutional anger of someone who had not made his peace with it. He confirmed what June's own reconciliation had shown. Forged signatures on 11 transfer authorizations. $26,400 moved in total. The destination account was Daniel Flood, Harwick, Vermont. He asked if I wanted to file a criminal complaint. I said I wanted to give my brother one opportunity first. 1. Stewart looked at me the way professionals look at people who have chosen the harder path for reasons they understand, but wouldn't choose themselves. He said the fraud file would be ready whenever I needed it. He gave me a copy of the documentation. I put it in the envelope. Now the envelope was 3 inches thick and it held the prepared demand document from January, the bank's fraud investigation report, the 11 transfer records with the forged signatures flagged, the communication log I had been keeping since June's phone call, and a letter from Patricia Voss, a civil attorney in Burlington who I had consulted in August, confirming the civil liability exposure and the criminal exposure under Vermont's charitable solicitation fraud statute, which carries, I want you to know, a penalty of up to 5 years. I drove to my parents' house on a Saturday in October. The morning was the particular Vermont October morning that makes the drive beautiful against your will, the sugar maples on Route 2 going orange and deep red, the sky clear and high and cold. I drove the 40 minutes the way I drove everything important, methodically, without the radio, turning through the problem one more time to make sure I knew every corner of it before I walked into the room. The envelope was on the passenger seat. I had taken it from the filing cabinet the night before and set it on the kitchen table and looked at it for a while. I had opened it, read through each document one final time, confirmed every page was in order. Then I had put it back in the envelope, sealed it with a single piece of tape across the flap, and set it by my keys. It was 3 inches thick, and it contained 9 years of professional competence and 9 months of careful waiting, and the complete legal exposure of a man who had counted on his sister being too sick or too exhausted or too generous to do anything about what he had taken. I had called ahead and asked them both to be there, and to please have Daniel there as well. My mother asked what it was about. I said I needed to talk to the family about the fund. My father opened the door. He looked at my face, and then at the envelope under my arm, and he looked the way he had looked when I was 9 and fell out of the maple tree. A second of pure fear that he composed into steadiness before he stepped aside to let me in. The living room has not changed in the 20 years since I moved out. Same couch, same oval rug, same family photos in their arrangement on the east wall. My brother was already there when I came in, standing by the window with a coffee mug and the practiced ease of someone who doesn't know a room has changed temperature yet. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him in person. He had a tan from the summer. I noted that and filed it. I sat on the couch. I put the envelope on the coffee table in front of me. I did not open it. I looked at my brother and I told him plainly what I knew. I named the amount, $26,400. I named the 11 transfers. I named the dates. I named the destination account, which was his. I told him June had the bank's fraud report. I told him I had consulted an attorney. I said all of it in the same voice I used for client presentations, level and specific and without decoration, because decoration was not something this moment needed. Daniel's face went through several things. The first was surprise, which confirmed that he had not expected to be caught, or had expected more time before the catching. The second was a kind of scrambling, the visible internal work of a person constructing a story. And then he landed on the version he had decided to present. He said the money had been a loan. He said he had intended to pay it back before I even needed to access the fund. He said things had gotten complicated faster than he expected and he had been trying to figure out how to fix it. He said this to me, to my face, in a room where our parents were listening, a loan from a cancer fund, taken without asking, with a forged signature, a loan. My mother's hands were in her lap, very still. My father looked at the oval rug. I let Daniel finish. I waited until there was no more of the story coming and the room was quiet. Then I picked up the envelope and I held it out to him. He took it with the instinct of someone who doesn't yet know what they're holding. He looked at it. He looked at his own name on the cover, written in my handwriting in January before any of it had happened. His face changed. I told him what was in it. I did not make him open it in the room, though I would have let him. I told him the demand document, the bank fraud report, the attorney's letter, the full liability exposure under Vermont civil and criminal statute. I told him Patricia Voss had reviewed everything and the file was complete. I told him the bank's fraud officer was waiting for my call. And then I told him the choice. Full restitution of $26,400, in writing, with a signed repayment agreement drafted by my attorney, beginning within 30 days. In exchange, I would not file the criminal complaint. I would not contact the Attorney General's office. The civil demand would be satisfied by the repayment agreement rather than by a judgment. I told him I would give him 1 week to decide. Daniel said nothing for a long time. He was looking at the envelope in his hands. Then my mother spoke. She said his name once, and her voice had something in it I had not heard from her in years, something that was not the measured management she usually applied to Daniel's situations. It was something flatter and heavier. She said, "Daniel, did you buy the boat with that money?" It was not a question. He did not answer. He did not have to. My father looked up from the oval rug. He looked at Daniel and then he looked at me, and he did not look away the way he sometimes looked away when things were hard. He held my gaze and his jaw moved once, and then he said very quietly, with the steadiness of a man choosing something he should have chosen a long time ago, "Tell her yes or no." The room was very still. Daniel said, "Some of it." My mother closed her eyes. My father said, "Then you will pay it back, every dollar." Not a request, a statement. From a man who had spent years softening things for his son, who had co-signed the loans and made the calls and kept the peace. I had never heard him use that voice with Daniel. It cost him something to use it. I could see that it cost him something and I was grateful he spent it. Daniel did not argue. I took the envelope back. I told him my attorney would send the repayment agreement by Wednesday. I told him I expected the signed copy returned by Saturday. Then I stood up. My mother walked me to the door. We stood in the hall for a moment, the two of us, and her face was the face of a woman who had just seen something she had been choosing not to see for a very long time. She said, "I should have asked more questions, when you were in the hospital, about how the money was moving." I said, "You didn't know, Mom." She said, "I didn't ask." There is a difference, she was saying. I knew there was a difference. I also knew that she was 61 years old and that she was standing in her hallway saying, "I didn't ask," instead of "I couldn't have known," and the distinction was the whole thing. She was not managing this one. She was looking at it. I touched her arm. "He can still fix it," I said. "If he does what he said." She nodded. Her eyes were wet, but she kept them open. I walked to my car in the October cold, the envelope under my arm, thinner now that it had been delivered, though I had taken it back. The elm tree in my parents' front yard had gone orange and was dropping in the particular way Vermont elms drop in October, large and sudden, like decisions. Daniel signed the repayment agreement on Friday. 4 days, not 7. $26,400, structured over 18 months. The first payment arrived on the 1st of November, which was the date specified in the agreement. It has arrived on the 1st of every month since. I do not believe this is a change in who Daniel is. I believe it is a change in what he understands about what I will do if he isn't. That is its own kind of progress. My mother called me the Sunday after the Saturday in the living room. She called from her cell, which was the Tuesday register, not the Sunday register, and I understood from the deviation that she had things she needed to say that the usual schedule could not contain. She said that she and my father had been talking. That they had not understood the full extent of what Daniel had done while I was in treatment, that the word forged was a word she was still trying to settle with, that it was not a word she had ever expected to apply to her son. She said she wanted me to know that they were not going to minimize it the way they sometimes minimized his situations. She said that phrase, his situations, with the specific weariness of a woman who had been using it as a euphemism for 35 years and had finally heard herself say it clearly. I said, I know it's hard. She said, it's harder knowing you went through it alone, the treatment and this at the same time. I told her I hadn't been entirely alone. I told her about June, about the texts every morning, about the soup calibrated to the number, about the yellow legal pad and the 2 cups of coffee and the way June had set up the fund as if it were a logistics problem she had already solved. My mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I want to thank her. I told her June would say she was only doing what neighbors do. My mother said, I know, I still want to thank her. She called June the following week. I don't know exactly what they said to each other. June mentioned it to me only briefly, at the mailboxes one morning, with the characteristic economy of a woman who does not require recognition for things she considers obvious. She said, Your mother has good manners. That was the entire report. I chose to interpret it as high praise. My father called that Sunday from the house phone, as usual. He asked about the remission, the scans, the follow-up schedule. He asked practical questions in the practical way he had always asked things, and when we had covered the practical ground, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I want you to know I'm proud of the way you handled it. Not, I'm sorry we didn't catch it sooner. Not, I'm sorry it happened. My father did not have the architecture for those sentences, and I did not require them. He said he was proud. In the language of Owen Flood, who had been a math teacher and a steady man and a father who had not always been as present as I needed in the ways that mattered most, that sentence was a full accounting. Thank you, Dad, I said. He said, You've always been the one I didn't worry about. I held the phone. Something in that sentence that I had once considered a compliment was showing me its other side, the one I didn't worry about. Which meant the one who got the worry taken away from her too early and given to someone else. I had earned my own reliability. I had worked for it and kept it and believed in it. But I had not been fine alone the way they had assumed I was fine alone. There had been a June-shaped gap in my family's understanding of what I needed, and June herself, a neighbor who had no obligation to me beyond a shared hallway, had filled it. I did not say any of that to my father. It was too large for a phone call and he was 65 and doing what he could. I said, I know, he said, don't do that again, the not asking. I said, okay, Dad, he said, good. And we hung up, and I went to make dinner, and that was the most direct conversation my father and I had ever had, and it was enough. The boat, as far as I know, is still on Lake Champlain. I have no interest in what happens to it. It is not mine, and it never was, and the money that paid for part of it is coming back in $1,400 monthly installments. And that is the end of what the boat means to me. What I think about instead is the fund itself. The $34,000 that 214 people put together for a woman they knew or half knew or heard about through someone else, because they believed in covering someone's gap. That money existed because of June and because of a community that understood that covering each other's gaps was not weakness. It was the whole point. The theft was real. The restitution is real. But underneath both of those things, untouched by either of them, is the original fact of what people did when they heard I was sick. 214 people. I have the donor list. I have looked at it once on a quiet Sunday in December, sitting at my kitchen table with the dark blue notebook and my Sunday coffee. I read every name. Some of them I knew well, the neighbors and colleagues and the parents of kids I had tutored. Some I knew loosely, the way you know people in a town you grew up in, recognizable by face or name without quite knowing the story. Some I did not know at all. An address in Burlington. A woman whose note said she had gone through cancer treatment 5 years earlier and knew what it cost, the real cost, the kind that doesn't show up in any single bill. I wrote in the notebook, 214 people chose this. Not a one of them chose a boat. I closed the notebook. I think about that when I walk the Winooski River path in the evenings, which I could not do 18 months ago because 18 months ago, I was still counting the days I managed to walk to the end of the block and back as victories. I am walking long distances now. The river path in the fall goes orange and gold, and the water is high with October rain, and I walk until my legs want to stop, and then I walk a little further because that is the habit I built in recovery, and I am keeping it. I walk and I think about the 214 names, about June's yellow legal pad and 2 cups of coffee, and the look on her face that meant she had already done the research and was going to help me regardless of what I said, because that was who she was. About my father saying, don't do that again, the not asking. about the filing cabinet in January and the Saturday mornings, and the specific grief of preparing for a betrayal you hoped wouldn't come. June is still 3 doors down. She still texts today, every morning with the same punctuation, that small question mark that means. I am here, I am paying attention, you get to decide how much. I text back a number. It is mostly 8s and 9s now. On the very good days, I text her a 10 and she sends back a single star and we leave it there, because we are two people who have learned to communicate everything important in the smallest possible denominations, and neither of us requires anything more elaborate than that. The envelope is back in the filing cabinet, between the lease and the tax returns, exactly where I put it in January when I had hoped never to use it, and prepared it carefully anyway. I have thought about taking it out and going through it one more time, reading it as a document of what I had known was possible, and had prepared for anyway, a record of the version of myself who sat at the kitchen table on 3 January Saturdays and did the hard work of not looking away. But I find I don't need to read it again. I know what's in it. I know every page in order. I know what it weighed in my brother's hands when he understood what he was holding. I know what it felt like to hand it over calmly in a room where I had every reason to be something other than calm. The calm was the victory. I knew that even before I walked in. Some rooms you enter not to win a fight but to end one, and the way you end it is by being the only person in it who is not afraid. I was not afraid. I had spent 9 months being afraid of something much larger than my brother. After cancer, Daniel was a problem I already knew how to solve. I keep the notebook too, the dark blue one from December, the one I opened on the night of the diagnosis with the questions I needed answered. It has a lot of pages in it now. The treatment timeline, the insurance gaps, the fund documentation, the column of 11 transfer amounts with the right aligned totals, the repayment schedule. And on the very last page with writing on it, a single entry from a Tuesday in September, which was the day Dr. Ewan looked at my most recent scans and used the word remission. I wrote remission, and then I closed the notebook. Family, I've come to understand, is not only who shares your blood, it is who builds the net before you fall. June built mine. 214 people I will never all meet built it with her. My father, in a living room on a Saturday in October, chose something harder than he'd chosen before and held it steady. Those are the people at my table. And the ones who took from the table while I was learning to sit up again, they don't get to sit at it. Not out of cruelty, out of arithmetic. The debt has a payment schedule. The seat does not. That's my story. One envelope prepared in January and held for 9 months. One woman who showed up at my door with coffee and did not call it charity. And one October afternoon when I handed my brother everything I knew and stayed perfectly, deliberately, quietly calm. If someone in your life has been building your net without being asked, go tell them. Today, before you need it. If this found you somewhere it was supposed to, share it, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.